Welcome back, everyone. So in the last lesson, we learned how to optimize our React components. But in the beginning of the lesson, I mentioned that there's a chance that when you pass in an inline function to a component, that because in JavaScript functions are also objects, you are always instantiating a new function, meaning that it could get around your memoized component. Well, in this lesson, we are going to take a look at how we can actually memoize our functions so that we don't call them and re-render them unnecessarily if we do not have to. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's look at this test application where I've rewritten it so that it can demonstrate to us different ways that functions might behave and how we can optimize them. So we have this functional component, and inside of it, we have defined using useState two different state values. There's a count1 and a count2, which are pretty much just integers that start off at 0. We use the setCount1 and setCount2 to define these increment functions that simply increase the count of our count1 and count2 values by 1. That's all this function does. Then we have this function called logname. And this function is simply a console log that calls out my name, Yihua. Ignoring this section for now, what we show then inside of our return of this function is just two buttons that increment the counts and then one button that increments or that calls the log name, console logging my name. Now, what I've done here to demonstrate this to you is I have instantiated this new JavaScript collection called a set. Now, what a set is in JavaScript is it is a collection object, which is similar to an array. The only difference is that whenever you add anything to the set, it only will add it to the list if it's unique. Meaning that if we add the same function or the same object into it, and the reference already exists inside of this array, then it won't add it. Which means that as long as we're adding new reference by memory objects, then the set will increase. If we don't, then we're just going to end up adding the same function, but with a different place in memory. So as you remember with objects, objects can look the exact same as other objects in terms of its properties or in terms of its shape. But if it's a new object that gets instantiated, then it has a different reference in memory. So set is a way for us to actually keep track of whether or not we're generating new functions or if we're keeping the same function that has the same reference in memory. So what we do is that whenever our functional component re-renders, all of this is going to get recalled, but what we're doing is we're adding into this set our log name. And why am I doing this? Well, technically speaking, whenever we increase the count here, we are calling setState on our component, which will cause it to re-render. The moment it re-renders, it's also going to re-render our log name function. When it re-renders our log name function, it's going to re-add that function into this array or this set, so that whenever we actually see that we increase and call setState, that set is getting larger and it keeps passing new functions in. Because we're inlining this function inside of our functional component, we are therefore generating this function new every single time on every single re-render. But this is a costly thing because this function does not need to be regenerated. It doesn't need to render a new version. This function already is something that doesn't have any dependencies and it doesn't change, right? There's no properties coming in. Why do we need to reinstantiate this function? Well, this is actually exactly what the useCallback hook is for. The useCallback hook allows us to memoize a version of a function that we wrap in it and use that same function if it already exists. Now, it takes two arguments. The first argument is the function we want to memoize. The second argument is an array of dependencies, just like our useEffect hook. The only difference is that this array is mandatory with the useCallback hook. Now, because of course our function has 0 dependencies, we can simply pass an empty array. But there will be instances where we do need to pass in a dependency, and I'll show you in a little bit. But let's save this now, and let's now double check. Now we'll see what happens is that my function still works, but whenever I click increment count, and whenever my app re-renders, we're not actually adding in a new function anymore, because this function, every time it gets called to add this value, is using the memoized version of the function now. So the reference has not changed for this function. And this is really good for us because now we're no longer costly in generating a new log name function whenever our app component re-renders. So if we wanted to test this with the actual dependencies to pass in, we can actually do it with these two functions here. Instead of adding log name, what I'm going to do is log increment 1 and also add increment 2. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to wrap these. Actually, no, I'm not going to wrap them yet. Let's just see what happens whenever we click increment. So we see that we have two functions in when we instantiate, because when our component renders for the first time, they get added in. But when I click increment count, you'll see that I'm adding both the functions in because both functions are getting re-rendered. And as we just learned, this is the behavior to expect because we're not using our use callback hook. But now if we wrap this in our use callback hook and we pass it an empty array, we'll actually see that there will be a problem. So what is happening here? If we start hitting our increment count, we see that it's not working, right? While it does increment the first time on initialization, it's not actually increasing the count anymore, even though technically speaking, our function is not getting added in. So these are our functions and they're not getting regenerated. The reason for this, as you can see from this error or warning, is because we're missing a dependency inside of our use callback here. Our use callback knows that this function is dependent on count1, which is some variable outside of this function scope. This count1 is actually what gets generated as the function's definition when we instantiate this function, meaning that this function knows that whenever this function gets invoked, it's saying I'm going to use the set count1 function, but I'm going to set it to whatever count1 is currently when this function gets called or initialized for the first time. So if count1 was 0, then this value would be 0. So our function is literally a function that says I'm going to set count1 to 0 plus 1. So after that instantiates and our component re-renders because our count1 has been updated, so our local state gets updated, our component re-renders, it's going to check and see when it's reinitializing this function, it's going to say, oh, wait, there's no dependencies inside of this array for use callback, which means that I should never have to recreate this function because the dependency array only says the only time I want you to create a new array is if any of the values inside of this array changes. But now we're stuck with a function that always sets count1 equal to the first time count1 was instantiated, which was when it was 0. So if I now instead pass in count1 as the dependency, then we'll see that our call works the way we want it to. Because now when I click increase count1, we see that our value is increasing, but we also see that I'm adding in the appropriate count1 function that is new. Because when this value updates, count1 will go into this array and it'll say, oh, I want to reinstantiate this function, but count1 hasn't changed. Has the dependency count1 changed? Well, it has because we've incremented the value the last time we clicked this increment count1 function, meaning that I need to generate a new function. But then when we go to increment count2, it's going to say, okay, has the dependency in this function changed? It hasn't because count2 has stayed the same. Only count1 has changed. So then I don't need to create a new function here, meaning that the function add fails because this original function from when we first instantiated our increment count2 has not changed. Therefore, it only adds the new setCount1 functions that get generated due to the changing value of count1 whenever we increment this count. So hopefully this makes some sense, because this use callback is definitely useful inside of our functional components whenever we have to declare inline functions inside of this component definition, because on every re-render, we will end up instantiating the function multiple times. So this is just something that we have to keep in mind when building applications that are using classless components. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about useMemo, which is very similar to useCallback, but used just ever so slightly differently. So I will see you in the next lesson.